Control point, as you probably know, gives you the ability to report on, manage, and remove the permissions of or reassign the permissions of any users who are disabled or otherwise deleted in Active Directory. But there are some concerns that you do have to take into account when running this report, because it's definitely one of the more beefy reports, one of the larger reports. There are a few different steps to actually identifying, reporting on, and removing these users. And so if you have a large environment with a lot of turnover, with a number of users, there are a few different things that you have to take into account to make sure that you can successfully manage those orphaned users. Since this is more of a conceptual discussion, conversation about best practices, we won't actually be removing any orphaned domain users, and part of that is because in our own support environments we really don't get the kind of turnover on orphaned users that would help us. We don't have thousands of orphaned users or tens of thousands like I've seen in a couple of the environments we've worked with in the past. But today we'll be able to talk about the architectural overview of how the orphaned domain user report actually works, how it identifies what users are orphaned and how it reports on them, and how it deletes them. We'll be able to talk about handling different methods of authentication, removing obviously default authentication users, NTLM or Windows Claims users, or removing users using an alternate authentication method. We'll talk about how the report scales, and we'll talk about what best practices to use when you're running the report on a large environment to make sure the report completes successfully, and that you can set this up regularly and have it as more of a turnkey operation, as something that will delete those users without you having to actively input into it. So let's start by talking about the actual architectural overview of the Orphaned Domain User Report. Like I mentioned before, it's actually one of our more involved reports. The beginning of the Orphaned Domain User Report is actually, on the back end, almost identical to any other site permissions or comprehensive permissions report that we run if you're running it through our users and security section of Control Point. We need to identify what users have permissions and where. And in order to do that, we have to validate against their existing permissions. Once we identified the table of users that have permissions, we validate those users against basically the people picker or the authentication mechanism of the web application that Control Point is installed on. So if a user doesn't resolve on the Control Point configuration site, if they show up as disabled or you can't select them, we would expect those users with permissions to show up in the Control Point Orphaned Domain User Report. Now that can include any users that are disabled from Active Directory or any users that are completely deleted. The report will actually show you, and it'll separate between the two. You'll be able to see if a user is disabled. It'll show up as disabled. There are two different options for actually managing those permissions once you identify what they are. There's actually an icon on the report itself that allows you to delete all users from that home farm. It basically creates a delete user permission job, another one of Control Point's uses security jobs, and removes the actual literal string of those users. If you run this report, obviously you can't resolve those users to remove them, but it'll actually remove the domain/username of those users. The other option that you have available is you can actually set the job up to automatically delete those users, and what that will do is that will create a scheduled job within Control Point that will by default run 30 minutes after the report completes. That is that delete user permission job that we talked about here. So the question that we get asked a lot is, how do we handle authentication and user authentication in the Orphaned Domain User Report? Like I mentioned in the previous slide, it validates against the Control Point web application, and any users that don't resolve in the Control Point web application will not resolve in the Orphaned Domain User Report, and they will show up as disabled or deleted. Now, by default, that web application is created with NTLM or Windows Claims Authentication if you're using our installer, but Control Point does support any form of alternate authentication, any kind of ADFS or custom claims provided that you want to put in place. We have something called a Control Point native kit, which I'm sure some of the people on the call right now have used, that allows you to install Control Point into an existing web application or create a web application with an alternate authentication method that you choose and install Control Point into that and use a service account using that authentication mechanism. I've shown the link here to the actual Control Point native kit, but if you access the Metalogix website and navigate to our support section, it's right there under Control Point downloads. Now we get into sort of the meat and potatoes of why we're here on this call today, and that's to talk about some of the limitations of scalability of the report and how to get around the fact that it's a very large report. It can be very time-consuming. And from our experience, it's probably the report that comes up the most often when people talk about reports not completing successfully because of an IAS reset or a scheduled backup that takes content databases offline, or Control Point's nightly application pool recycle. So the key to note is that every user that's returned with permissions in the scope that we choose needs to be validated against Active Directory or the people picker for the Control Point web application more specifically. As you can probably imagine, that's a time-consuming process for larger farms. It scales reasonably well, but if you have tens of thousands of users, you can probably imagine that that's the kind of report that would take quite a while to return. After that process, the orphan users, we don't try to delete them all at once. We delete them in batches of 100. And I know some of you are probably saying, well, I'm never going to have 100 orphan users at a time, but we run into it a lot when people first get Control Point, when they first pick up the product, and they're trying to do that initial cleanup on their farm, and you see that they get thousands or even tens of thousands of orphan users because they've had SharePoint up for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, and it's really been sort of a Wild West situation. They haven't actively used SharePoint or managed permissions. So in order to keep from the report just completely bombing out or having out-of-memory exceptions or issues like that, we delete in batches of 100. So what are the best practices to be able to run this report effectively, not hit IAS resets, application pool recycles, content databases going offline, and successfully return and act on those orphaned users? I've included a few of them here, but I'll also talk about a few options that we have. We definitely want to recommend the biggest one, that's actually not the first one on here, is that we should always schedule this report out. Control Point has a built-in 60-minute session timeout. You may have seen a message when running a larger report that says an action or analysis that you're trying to run is taking longer than expected. That means that after 60 minutes, Control Point will no longer update that frame with the report or the task audit for the orphan domain user deletion action. Because of that, if you're running the report live, even if you're setting it up to automatically delete those users, it can be difficult to confirm that the report's run successfully, and it can be difficult to compare against or validate the users that are returned in that report. So we definitely always recommend scheduling that report. You can have the report results output to an email. It can be an Excel spreadsheet or PDF or CSV, or output them to a SharePoint list for you to access and act on as needed if you choose not to delete those users immediately. The other option that we definitely recommend is if you're in a larger farm, if you're in a farm that you know has a large number of orphaned users, limit the report scope to a smaller scope than, say, the entire farm. You may want to run the report just against a single web application, a group of larger site collections, all the way down. The scalability obviously is based entirely off of how complex your farm is, how many orphan users you have, and it's difficult to give a specific, here's the exact scope you want to run it on, here's what we expect the report to be able to do, because there are a lot of different factors that can bottleneck that. But if you follow the best practices that we have available, and if you pay close attention to how long the report takes to run, how scalable it is, how often you're running the report, if you have this scheduled to automatically clean up orphan domain users once a month, and you find that it's hitting those application pool recycles because too many users are being removed or modified, you may want to schedule that to run against once a week or even every 3 days or something like that. It's definitely a your mileage may vary kind of situation because no two environments are the same, no two farms are the same. Everybody's environment is unique, and there can be several different factors that that limit our ability to run the report. One of the things that you can check for validation, let's say you run into that session timeout that we talked about. The report doesn't complete, and you know that it was set up to run an automatic user deletion after it completes. Control Point's schedule monitor will actually create that scheduled job to remove those users. So if you aren't able to complete the report, you aren't able to identify the completion of the report, or it completes and you want to pause the deletion job before you actually delete those users, if you navigate to the schedule monitor, we'll have created just a regular delete user permissions job, and you'll be able to edit the schedule of that, add or take out any users as needed, or even pause the job, set it not to run so that you can validate those users and take your time and not be necessarily caught up with, okay, we have X amount of time in order to actually validate these users. One of the questions that actually gets asked a lot that I haven't included in the slide here is what happens if users are modified? One of the things that people ask a lot is I have a series of users that have gotten married or changed their names, or our naming structure had changed at some point because of a merger or an acquisition, and somebody who may have at one point been, let's say, Metalogic / P. McNally is now Metalogic / Paul McNally. We actually look at the SID for the account rather than the literal here's the name of the account. So if you are running Orphaned Domain User Report and someone's name has changed and their permissions exist in SharePoint under that old name, they will not be returned on the Orphaned Domain User Report as long as that user can still validate their SID against the Control Point Web Applications People Picker. So it's been a common question that's asked. It's not something to worry about. We do not remove any users that aren't actually deleted and don't actually validate. So the Orphaned Domain User Report is definitely one of our more complicated reports, definitely one where your mileage may vary. The reason we have these quick takes are a direct result of people opening tickets, people asking questions, people needing to scale this report. And so we want to at least have those best practices and be here to answer any questions that anybody has about the scalability of that report. I see there are some people on here, and I do appreciate you guys joining us. I know that the holiday is coming up tomorrow, and anybody who's in the U.S., I hope you do have a great holiday. But I do want to open this up to any questions, any concerns, anything we can answer on this call regarding Orphaned Domain User Report, permissions management. Somebody asked, is there a report to help with a user that changes their name? That's a really good question, and we've actually had a few people ask that, hey, can I actually modify those permissions to change the name? If you run that delete user permissions report, and this is one of those times I wish I had an installation of Control Point in front of me to check this for you, you can actually reassign user permissions to a different user. So what we've seen in the past that does work, you take the original account, let's say the Metalogic / P. McNally one that I mentioned before. You enter it into the People Picker to delete that user's permissions, but you don't resolve it. You don't click the little checkbox to validate it against Active Directory, and it stays in there as Metalogic / P. McNally. I pick the option to reassign those users' permissions, and I choose to reassign it to the actual Metalogic / Paul McNally. When you actually go to select that, it looks for the literal string Metalogic / P. McNally, and it reassigns those permissions out to Metalogic / Paul McNally. Same SID on the back end, yes, but the actual user credentials are updated to match the new last name. So great question, common question that we see. Control Point does allow you to manage that. Somebody else asked to be able to remove orphan users that are in a SAML claims format, or really any custom claims provider, it applies the same way. Does Control Point need to be running in a SAML claims web application? And the answer is yes. Any kind of custom authentication, Control Point needs to be running in a web application that supports that custom authentication. Now, if you're using an authentication provider other than NTLM or standard Windows claims, we really do recommend using the Control Point native kit, because custom authentication provider users, they won't resolve through the regular web application that Control Point creates as part of the installation process. And modifying that web application after the fact to support those claims users can cause issues with our other reports. It can cause Control Point to become inaccessible, or some of the services that we put into the SharePoint Hive under the template layouts Exceller directory to become inaccessible for the service account. So if you have orphan users that are in any kind of SAML claims is the example used here, but any kind of custom authentication, we definitely recommend installing into a SAML claims web application, or one that supports SAML claims, or any custom authentication provider. And we recommend doing that using the Control Point native kit rather than the standard kit. And again, that native kit is available right on our website under product support and downloads. So, great questions. Very good. Obviously, we have the question box right there in your webinar screen there. You can ask any questions. Additionally, too, we take any feedback on things people would like to see either in the product or in a quick take. Our support staff, our dispatch team is available. We would recommend actually calling in directly with any questions at 202-609-9100. It's right on our website. But I can tell you that the Orphan Domain User Report, like a number of other things in Control Point, is actually in the product as a direct result of people asking for it. People specifically said this is a management task that's difficult to do through, say, PowerShell, or really impossible to do through the SharePoint UI. We would like to have this available within Control Point, and we created it. So we welcome, trust me, we welcome all feedback. I can tell you that 80% of the things that are added to Control Point are a direct result of client requests. It's not market research. It's not, the experts. We ask people who are using SharePoint, the actual SharePoint community, what they want in the product, and you get things like this. So I'm not seeing any other questions. Obviously, if you think of any questions after this, somebody asked, is there a danger in removing orphan users, actually? Well, it depends on the level of customization. Obviously, if there are things like workflows that are owned by an orphan user or something like that, that can be a concern. Like I mentioned a little bit before, the Orphan Domain User Report, the delete user action, actually allows you to reassign user permissions. One of the things we've seen people do if they have custom content in place, they actually reassign the user permissions back to the service account or the account running the application pool. That way, anything that was dependent on those users, any kind of workflows or custom features or solutions or web parts or anything like that, will run under the service account, an account that they know has the right permissions to that web application. As for things that are, let's say, owned by that account, metadata for versioning, things like that, will still be in place for that user. If a user that was orphaned had uploaded a version of an item or they had the last modified metadata, that will still apply to them. The only thing that would be a concern, obviously, is that if you are migrating or something like that, that metadata for an orphan user or a user that doesn't validate an Active Directory, it would not migrate over. But any items that are last modified or created by a user that's orphaned will still be available in SharePoint. We're just deleting the actual permissions that they have within SharePoint. We're not removing any items that are created by them or any metadata that's assigned to that user. So yeah, these are great questions. I know like I said, the Orphan Domain User Report is kind of a scary one because you're just taking bulk permissions out of SharePoint, but the metadata and the catalog and stuff for those users are still present, so you're not going to lose any functionality. And if you are concerned about it, if you're concerned about any custom content or workflows, you can reassign those permissions back to any other user, which is a pretty common practice in Control Point if someone takes over for somebody else. So I want to thank everybody for joining the Quick Take. I know that a few people joined after the start. The Quick Take has been recorded. It will be posted on the Metalogix website on our knowledge base. We have a new portal in place. Anybody that's opened a ticket recently probably has access to that portal. And if you don't, you could contact our dispatch team. You can see all of your tickets, view our knowledge base, view closed cases, get a history of the issues any issues you've asked about or faced within Control Point, what our resolution was, and how we were able to take care of you. And you can actually open a ticket directly through our portal now as well. So we've added a lot of resources to make it easier for you to get in touch with our support team directly, to work with us and answer any questions that you have about Control Point or any of the other Metalogix products. So I want to thank everybody for joining. Any other questions, please feel free to contact us on our support team, either through the Metalogix website, our portal, or the phone number I listed before. And for everyone in the U.S., have an excellent holiday. For everyone else, please feel free to contact us with any questions or concerns. Thank you very much, and have a great day, everybody.